leader, long-standing leader, Bashar al Assad, had actually fled. We later found out he's in Moscow seeking asylum there, and that we've got this formally, we're told formally, Islamist rebel group, HTS, who are now pretty much in charge, along with many other rebel groups. A lot of people in the West are sort of welcoming Assad's fall and cautiously warning about what might happen. You've been following the events closely. Do you welcome Bashar Assad's fall, or do you think that actually what could happen in Syria next could be even worse than what's happened in recent years?
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, trying to stay on top of this stuff is like juggling jelly, and you know, it's my job to do that. And so for a layperson to try and keep abreast of this is a real challenge. In terms of Assad, I think we can objectively say that he is a complete monster, and his removal is kind of objectively a good thing. Subjectively, however, what comes next is a really big challenge, and this could go in so many different directions. There's so many variables here. You have military groupings, you have religious groupings, you have external players like Turkey, like Russia, like the United States, like Iran, and of course Israel are fully involved here as well. So where we go forward from here with particularly HTS is going to be really interesting. They've made a lot of moderate noises, given that they come from an extremely radical background. And the challenge is going to be whether they actually mean it or whether they're just going to go full jihadi once they've consolidated their position.
And that's the thing, be careful what you wish for. And we saw what happened in many of the other countries that had the Arab Spring in 2011. People like me were wonderfully optimistic, but it did not work out well for most of those countries. We've seen what's happened with Libya and elsewhere after the fall of Gaddafi. But this thing, HTS, this Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they're a prescribed terrorist group. Lots of talk this morning from the government. Pat McFadden, the Cabinet Office Minister, who's been out and about doing the media round, saying they're looking at possibly changing that designation. And you think, well, why does that matter? But the governments aren't allowed to talk to terrorist groups because they're terrorist groups. So there may be a need to talk to them if they're the ones in power. But when a leader like this is Abu Muhammad Al-Jolani, when someone like him, they push this message, oh, well, you know, we renounce our close links with Al-Qaeda, we won't do this. Given their history, given the large parts of Syria they have been in charge of, where we've seen the beheadings, the executions of women for adultery and things like that. By the way, a woman committing adultery means that even if she's been raped, she's technically committed adultery. I mean, we are talking about a very cruel regime. And, of course, the concerns about ISIS returning. How far can we trust whoever does take charge?
Well, Jolani's background is about as bad as it gets. He was radicalised by the Second Intifada. Jolani's not his real name; it's his nom de guerre, and that is a deliberate reference to the Golan Heights that Israel currently hold. So you know, he's clearly got a background in extremely radical Islam. He was an Al-Qaeda fighter in Iraq. He was sent by ISIS after he was Al-Qaeda to Syria to fight there. HTS themselves were the Al-Nusra Front, which were some of the worst atrocities in the Syrian war.
But now they're basically the Liberal Democrats of the Middle East, we're told.
Yeah, and that's completely disingenuous. And we do have evidence that they've administrated relatively fairly in northwest Syria. They have committed atrocities against civilians, but not on ISIS level of scale. And you know, clearly we're never going to get that down to zero with these people. So they've shown improvement, which is all we can hope for.
Yeah. But we should certainly, it's especially a case of be careful what you wish for at this point.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, Al-Jolani's got an opportunity here to sort of consolidate his power base, and so he's making all the right noises. But we saw with the Taliban in Afghanistan, they made all the right noises as well when they took over, and quickly went downhill for everyone. So,
and now women aren't allowed to speak outside of their homes.
Exactly that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, I mean, what about ISIS as well? Because there's a big concern about ISIS. I mean, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, you know, these guys, I mean, a lot of people say that what's the difference? But huge number of ISIS fighters are held in camps in northern Syria. We've also got ISIS brides, you know, the likes of the Shamima Begums. What's likely to happen to them?
Well, ISIS have had a very bad 24 hours. They had American B-52s in the air last night, hitting, I think it was 70-plus targets, ISIS-related. So the West is very alive to this potential threat. I've certainly also seen warnings from people I know who visited the prison camps in the north, and their estimate is that those things are powder kegs waiting to go off. So when I spoke a moment ago about the number of variables out there, this is one of the really big ones. Yeah. The fact that straight away, as soon as Assad fell, the West took action against ISIS, known ISIS locations, I think that's a very clear indicator that there's absolutely no appetite to give them even a sliver of a chance of reproducing.
Yeah, very interesting. And were you surprised at all that Assad didn't get the help that he's previously had from Iran and from Russia to maintain his brutal regime? And obviously he's now fled to Moscow. It's the safest place for him to go. Although, you know, I suppose there are plenty of dodgy Middle Eastern countries like the Qatars and everywhere who they're quite happy to have brutal killers turn up on their shores and book a nice apartment there and live there as millionaires, aren't they? But were you surprised he didn't get that help?
Yes and no. I think the scale of the collapse was the surprising thing. That he collapsed at all isn't hugely surprising, but how fast it happened was a real shock. But if we stop and take stock, it makes a lot of sense. The two key backers he had were Hezbollah and Russia. Both those organisations are having a challenging time with other conflicts. Hezbollah have been turned from a very effective army into essentially a regional militia by Israel. They've been absolutely beyond decimated in the last 3 or 4 months. And their fighters legged it almost immediately back over the border as soon as HDS, as soon as their advance was consolidated. And Russia are clearly having a really rough time in Ukraine. They're having to bring in troops from Yemen, from North Korea. They simply don't have the resources to come in hard on Assad's side at this point. So, yeah, the speed was surprising, but the fact it happened, not so much.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm waiting to see when the Islamist rebels in Syria decide to thank Israel for their help. Because, of course, if it wasn't for the Hamas attack on Israel, we would not have seen the Hezbollah attack on Israel, the retaliation, the destruction of Hezbollah and Iranian foreign forces, effectively. I mean, the jigsaw puzzle of this is quite extraordinary, isn't it? I wonder, I mean, in terms of to people who, you know, I often talk about this, like whether it's Ukraine or what's going on in the Middle East, and it's something we see all over social media as well, and people just say, I don't know what it's got to do with me. We shouldn't get involved. Like after Iraq and Afghanistan, remember people back in, 12-odd years, 13 years ago saying, we don't want any involvement in Syria. You know, people die. Well, of course, when we didn't get involved, we saw what happened, and 500,000 people were brutally murdered by Assad. When people are still being imprisoned, executed, tortured, people being rescued from those prisons. I'm sure some of those are people who we wouldn't want out on the streets. Many of them will be people who simply wanted democracy and been imprisoned by the Assad regime. But we're in this situation, yet again, where people are saying, it's not our problem. But, of course, what happened in Syria very much became our problem in 2015 when we saw that mass wave of millions, 7 million refugees fled Syria. How concerned should we be about how this impacts us in the West? If we're going to talk purely, selfishly, we've got every right to do in this country, in terms of ISIS fighters being freed, the likes of the Shamima Begums, ISIS brides like that, coming back to this country, able to travel freely. Law-abiding citizens, but scared of the new regime, Syrian refugees coming to Europe, possibly to the UK. What should our concerns be there?
Well, clearly we've seen instability in countries that have led to huge migrant flows. If you look at the demographics of people coming across the Channel, the majority now are Afghan as a direct result of our withdrawal from Kabul. So I think for the UK, there's two things here. First of all, we need to make sure that these countries don't descend into situations where people feel the need to flee. And then, of course, we need to sort out the problem in the Channel of illegal crossings to make sure that at least if we're going to bring people to the UK as refugees, we know who they are and we know that they're not going to be a security threat. Yeah.
I still remember David Cameron said they'd just take 4,000 a year, but from the camps, fully verified and the most deserving people, 20,000 in total. It's an absolute outcry in the media and on the left. And the British people went, still think that's too many. I mean, British people have got sense. Can I just ask you just finally, I mentioned this bit earlier to Claire Pearsall, but John Simpson, BBC's John Simpson, a man, many people have known and trusted for many years, he tweeted, for some bizarre reason yesterday, Bashar al Assad has done many evil things, but he's weak rather than wicked. His family members, Iran and especially Russia, told him what to do and he feebly did it. In person, I found him meek and anxious to please, the reverse of the traditional dictator. What do you make of that?
I think it's a good example of how you can easily get things wrong on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it.
This is the analysis from a top figure at the BBC.
It is, and that constrained nature of that particular platform can certainly throw up these challenges. The bottom line here is that Assad had agency. He was a monster. The things that are coming out of Damascus in those prisons, the gassing of children and ethnic groups. I mean, this guy is a top tier tyrant monster of the worst kind. And I don't think it's wise or clever to try and make excuses or justify or try and explain his appalling regime in any way.
He didn't look like a tyrant, but he was one. Just because he made a nice cup of tea when you interviewed him doesn't make him not a tyrant. Andrew Fox, thank you for that. Really appreciate that. Quick reaction from Claire Pearsall.
Yeah, I think what Andrew just said is right. We need to be incredibly concerned at what comes next. This is not a nice, fluffy, Lib Dem style takeover.
Not that we want a Lib Dem takeover in this country either, by the way.
But I think it's probably
Yes.
preferable to a bunch of terrorists.
Yeah,
and I think most people would see
These
that.
people do not change their spots.
They don't.
Yeah.